Hello, and welcome to this video. Here, we'll continue off from the overview and start looking into setting up our widgets and or what do our widgets mean. Please keep in mind that this video will only cover the widgets in 1.2, and for more information on 1.1 and how the entire framework works, please check the documentation. Okay, starting off from our copy advanced elements that we did last session, we're going to be looking at the vertical text. In here, you'll notice that there are a couple of things, but overall the structure is very simple. We inherit from our widget general page, and then you can see here that most of our functionality exists inside the category switcher. To switch to a different category, you will have to run the switch UI. In this case, for our base element, you can just get one of the static name functions, and so that you don't accidentally mistype anything or something like that. If you would like to override some of the functionality, you can look into override here and then switch UI in case you want to add your own panels for the category switcher to handle. Just as a quick note, the first slot should be relatively empty. Like there should be no functionality here, as this is what we switch to when we fail to find a matching entry. Alright. Other than that, the only things that you might want to check out are things like save current settings, reset, check pending save, and cancel to give you a few more options. For this, you can check the functionality inside the 1v1. Just opening it rather quickly. You can check here the different things that you can do and elements in sections. This is going to be a theme throughout the example widgets. You can check the full implementation in 1v1, and the example elements are just going to be the simplified version of that fitting to a specific purpose. For 1.2, we're only going to be having the default examples. In the future, more layouts will be added. Okay, continuing from that, we're going to go over first, starting from the top, the audio page. Generally speaking, this is a very simple widget. It simply has to inherit from audio page, and then after that, you only really have to set up your defaults. So in here, which ID we're going for, and in terms of the elements, which property should we create. And lastly, you simply have to just select the audio slot class that you want to use, and then that's it. For the audio slot element, you can see that it's a relatively simple class. We only have one of our sliders and then one of our names, and then it simply just runs an update function whenever the slider is updated, and whenever it's initialized, we just simply set the text, and that's essentially what you can do here. If you want to override with your custom functionality, that's fine. Just keep in mind that it's up to you to play with it if you like to. Okay. So, going into a game page. Now, in 1.1, one of the bigger changes that 1.2 offers is that we have now introduced the concept of a game slot. And how this differs is that 1.1 required an entire sub-profile at the project settings to be displayed in a single place. Now this does mean that for larger amounts of settings, it's easier in a way to control this, but it also means that you have to implement some of this parsing yourself. So for instance, if we go to our update setting strings, like you do have to do some level of parsing to get all of this updated. And for some use cases, this is ideal, but there are also other cases where you just want to have one setting or maybe two and distribute them between different things, and this workflow was just not easy enough. So with the concept of game slots, you now have the ability to very quickly and very easily simply set up what parameter you're looking for at what profile and what type of setting it is, and then after that, the entire setup just really requires an update function to update your visuals whenever the subsystem gets updated, and then from whatever's updating your element, in this case a string switch, just to make sure that you update the widget and that you update the subsystem as well. So that's generally the concept. In 1.2, we have a boolean, slider, and a string, and you can see those in action inside the game page. So for instance, in here, each of them is just a game slot boolean, or like a game slot slider and a game slot string switch, and then in here you can see that this is a profile name that we're looking for, and then this is a setting. I'm going back to here. You can see that this is a profile, and then inside over here, this is a setting. And that's all you really need to do. And do keep in mind, however, that if you have any of these values set as false, you will need an external function to actually apply these values. For this, you can check either on the save functionality in the documentation or inside game settings, the broadcast method. All right. Moving on. We're going to be going to the graphics page. All right. So as implemented in 1.1, it follows the same overall example. A lot of things were parsed for you, but you still needed to have a significant amount of parsing on your right. And this has to do with the resolution, the window mode, and elements. There were some settings that you had to parse yourself. In 1.2, at least at the default level, we parse all of this for you at the C++ side and have a number of bind optional widgets that you can set to yourself. And as long as they match the name, everything will get updated automatically. So it's a very useful and simple way to have only the settings that you want. Maybe your game does not need dynamic resolution, and to not have access to that, you can just delete this element. And for instance, if I go over here, compiler results, it'll tell me that I have an optional binding widget for dynamic resolution. In terms of slot and slot profile, we have also made a child class from graphics slot called button, in which case it simply just abstract the vast majority of the information, and all you really have to do is focus on the specific style of what you want and what you're after. So then you can just focus on the design, and the same thing applies to graphics slot profile. All right, moving on to input. I'll go over this a little bit slower, given that this is probably the most complex element out of all of them. So generally speaking, your widget will mostly just consist of needing this scroll box list, and in case that you're going to be using manual input or manual bounding in terms of keys with modifiers, you can simply apply this information here by adding your own widget element. For this, just make sure that on construct you set the options window. If you don't set this boolean, even if the widget exists, it's not going to fully recognize it, so just keep that in mind. Okay, how this widget works is that it is going to be generating rows based on the class that you have set here. So this means that, for instance, if we go to a key slot, we can fully customize how this looks and what type of elements this has like. So for instance, and just to showcase this, let's say that I'm going to be making this blue, and then I'm going to making this, let's say, slider red, and then compile, and then in my test, let me just open my test map, and then if I play, let me just move this from my main display. I go to input, like you'll see that it updated, and I can do pretty much anything I want. So that's kind of how quickly you can get your things going, your setups and running. If you want to disable manual switching altogether in terms of display, just make sure that in your input slot you disable allow manual binding, and then this additional element will not be accessible to the user. Okay. All right, so heading back onto this, there are a couple more things that you really want to check. And in terms of key slot, one more thing is the only things that you really need are a couple of widget values. Again, we've bound a lot of these things to C++, so that you don't have to worry about any of this. Just make sure that you have the variables that you need. So for instance, maybe you want all of this to be a single button instead of having a separate button here. You could just simply have a horizontal box that lives inside the button, and then display both of these elements. So it's made to be as flexible as it can, within reason. And let me know if you have any questions. The input key is very similar. It's essentially what is used to display the value at the binding options level. And the only thing that you really have to do here is override a couple of functions where you just set an optional string, and then just the text and the texture, and then these values are taken off from what we explained earlier on the layout config data asset and the configurations that each of them have. Alright, and then last but not least, the input window. Now this one's probably the most complex out of all of them, and unless your application needs manual binding, you probably don't need to worry about this. And essentially what manual binding is, if you check from the documentation, is that standard binding means that you can request to replace a key, it will listen for your input, and then your next binding, like the next key that you press, that is compatible with both, the different type of thing. If you have, keyboard versus gamepad, and in your configuration, it'll set that up. Now, for most games and applications, that is going to be enough. There are some cases, however, like in virtualization software, where you want to have a little bit more control over what your elements have, especially if you have things like combo keys and stuff like that. So here you can specify if you want your manual key to have, like an Alt, Control, or Shift. If you want to also add CMD, you also can, but in the default implementation of the widget, at the default level, it does not exist. It's more up to you in terms of what you want to do and how you want to handle things. So overall, that's the general overview of the 1.2 layout. In terms of 1.1, it does get a little bit more complex, and as I mentioned earlier, the documentation does outline what functions you need to overwrite and how you need to use it. And if you have any more things that you'd like to check, I really recommend taking a look directly into these widgets and seeing how they work and what they do. That'll give you a much more clear understanding of the requirements that you need to do if you want to absolutely modify everything, and gives you far more control over parsing. The overall goal of these examples, just to reiterate one, are to present different layouts of things, of pre-configured setups that you might want to use. So in 1.2, we'll only be having the default one. In future updates, however, more layouts may be added. If you have any questions, let me know on either my email or Discord, and hope you have a nice day.